All right, welcome to the big number 10 of these Discord Q&A. Didn't really think when I did the first one that I'd be making so many of these or that I would be in a position where I'm making a number 10 and I have probably at least two more videos worth of questions. Honestly, more than two. This has to be more than two if I spend like any meaningful amount of time on these questions, right? Even though I was answering a question every like 8 minutes or something like that. This is probably what three or four more videos. So it's going to be a while to get through these. So apologies if you do come to my Discord and ask a new question. It may be a while because it's taken me a bit to get through these, even making multiple videos per week. So a couple of things for the beginning of this video. Something for those of you who are paying a lot of attention. I accidentally skipped over this question. By skipped over this question, I actually didn't skip this question in video number 9. It was that I recorded it and then I didn't realize that that question was in number 9 at the beginning of the original recording that I cut. If you look at, watch number 9, you'll notice, and I talk about this in the video, I actually cut the original recording of the beginning out so that I could replace the Yone question. Didn't realize I actually just forgot to cut in this answer to this question, so I'm just going to do it again. And then I have an ASol follow-up question that I thought was interesting enough to put at the top of the queue. But that's why I have these two here instead of this, which was the previous top runner from the end of number 9. So let's talk about why didn't junglers get an extra sum for quest? I feel like that would increase jungle fun a lot. So, a couple of reasons here. Number one thing I want to talk about is that we actually did test this. Basically, the moment that we had the extra slot in testing that we originally said we want an extra slot because we know that we want to do teleport as a top lane reward, even if you don't take teleport as a summoner. We had this extra slot, and one of the things that we tested very early on with that slot, besides teleport for top laners, was what if junglers get another summoner? Now, we knew that this slot was not going to get prime real estate in terms of the key, and that'll come up in a bit. But I think there are a couple of reasons why we moved away from this. One of the big ones is that the entire motivation to make the role quest system was such that we could tune the roles much more precisely than we'd been able to in the past. And the goal was to make it so that top lane and the bot carry role would be relatively power up comparatively to the other roles, especially jungle, right? And so any system that we did for jungle that was significant or substantial power up was going to be a tough sell. And let me tell you something, an extra summoner spell is really a lot of power. That was something that we found pretty quickly in testing, was that even when people weren't using it very well, weren't used to it, and it was on a weird key and hard to use, even though there was a version that we had in testing actually that you couldn't even press a key, you had to click on it, which was really unusable, to be honest. Even that version was just a lot of power. And so from a power perspective, given that we didn't have the time to redo the entire jungle quest, which is something that, I think is definitely on the table for the future, from a power perspective, there was no way we were going to give jungle an extra summoner spell worth of power without cutting a ton of power elsewhere. And we didn't really want to get into that business where we had a limited amount of time to do the role quests, and we wanted to focus on the ones that we wanted to be powerful and exciting, which were top and AD carry, or top and bot carry, I guess I should say. And so because of that, we got ourselves into a position where we just kind of discounted and like said, okay, we're going to move on from the jungle summoner thing, even if it could be cool, because it's just so much power, and we don't want to give that to jungle in this particular update because we're not going to spend the time to figure out where to drain that power elsewhere. The other thing that I think discouraged people or discouraged the designers that were working on the role quest system from pursuing this further, which to be clear was not me, I'm not talking about myself, was that we knew that this wasn't going to get a button that was close to the primary keys in League, right? Q, W, and E, especially, and to a lesser extent R, are sort of what we call like the primary keys, right? This is where the player's hand goes, and the further away a button is, the more stress we're putting onto a player to actually use it. One of the reasons why we can get away with adding V as a key and that being okay for the top lane and support quests, which are the activatable ones, which are teleport and control wards, is that the overwhelming majority of use cases for those spells are out of combat, right? Yes, I understand there are rare scenarios where you want to like control ward a bush in combat as a support, or where you want to teleport in combat as a top laner. But the overwhelming majority of those cases are out of combat, and so it's totally okay that those keys aren't prime real estate. It's not super time sensitive, and possibly more importantly, the targeting precision of those spells is not asking a lot from you, right? And so one of the difficulties that we ran into with the jungle summoners, for example, is that you think about like, hey, what if we give that jungle summoner to you when you complete your quest, right? That was what the original version of this that we tested did. And one of the things that came up was, oh, well, at that point in the game, there are a small number of summoners that you still want, right? Ignite is really out, right? You're probably not taking Ignite a lot of the time because at that point, it's like a lot of the power of Ignite is in the early game and you're not in the early game anymore. So what summoners are you taking? Well, for some junglers, it's Ghost, right? Like you're, say, Graves or something like that. It's like, yeah, Ghost is pretty good on you, right? Briar, right? You might take Ghost. Some of these champions that just get a lot of value out of movement speed that don't already take Ghost, like Hecarim, they might take Ghost, right? There's a couple champions that might take Flash, like Hecarim, who are going to take Ghost baseline for better early ganks. Hecarim, Shyvana type champions. They might take Ghost as a summoner and then take Flash later on. But the majority of junglers were not doing that, right? The majority of junglers like, okay, so what can I do to either maximize my effectiveness in a team fight or for the remaining like skirmishes and ganks that I'm going to be doing? Exhaust, right? And so Exhaust was really popular, and Exhaust actually asks for pretty precise timing and targeting requirements. You need to target the right person at the right time, right? You see Zed on the enemy team and you're like, oh, well, of course I'm going to take Exhaust as my jungle summoner every time. I'm going to stand near my AD carry, and when the Zed tries to go on my AD carry in this team fight, I'm just going to exhaust him, right? And that's a difficult sell when we knew that the key that we were going to be putting this on was going to be a low priority key that was going to be hard for people to get used to, especially one that was not going to be great for high fidelity usage, right? Especially high timing, like strict timing and targeting asks. And so because of that, we moved away from the idea of doing summoner spells because we knew a lot of the use cases for this extra summoner spell slot would be things that would ask a lot from something that we didn't think the key that we were going to use was going to be able to provide. And so all of this, I guess, in summary, is to say that I don't think that it is unreasonable that we might try this again in the future, right? Especially if we decide we want to like rearrange the default key bindings and put the role summon, like the role key closer, maybe on like T, for example. I actually don't even know what's bound to T by default. I've had it rebound for so many years. I have no clue. I have no idea what's there by default, right? But maybe T would be a good summoner, or like, sorry, a good key for the role quest. But when we were doing role quests initially, it's like, well, we don't even know if role quests are going to stick around, right? At this point, I think we look upon them pretty favorably, and I think we've been pretty happy with how they've worked so far. And so, from my perspective, I think there's a good shot that they're going to be in the game for eternity, right? But when we were making them initially, you don't set up looking to say, okay, well, we're definitely going to put this in the game forever, and that it has to stay in eternally. And so in light of that, and especially if we do decide to do more extensive jungle work where we might, have more ability to shift meaningful amounts of power around, this is the kind of thing we could revisit. Another thing I think that we could consider is, do we actually want Smite as a key late game? Like maybe we should be replacing your Smite with the summoner and you should get like some form of auto Smite, right? Maybe that could be good, right? We had that in the Ultimate Spellbook game mode, for example, so that junglers could take another summoner. And I think it was actually pretty well received there. Now, obviously, Summoner's Rift is a very different beast, but there's a lot of other considerations around summoners for junglers and what that should look like. I will say that one thing that's sort of correlated or related to this that I think is worth thinking about or like worth talking about is that I think we've generally come to regret letting Smite be castable on summoners. I think that has really not worked out. It was a very, very, very hype thing when it was originally introduced, but I think a lot of the incentives that it has created for its Smite's usage and a lot of the things that we had to do to the game as fallout as a result of that have largely not been good. And so even though it was a very cool thing back then when it was added, like, oh, you can smite champions now, I think that we kind of look upon that in design kind of unfavorably, including, by the way, the designer that actually did that change, who's still around. I think he's kind of come around and said, like, actually, kind of wish we didn't do that. And so that's the kind of thinking, like that line of thinking is the kind of thing that would, make us more interested in this area of like, okay, well, if we want to make Smite less interesting for junglers, or maybe even not have it at all in the future, or something as something we'd consider, maybe we should be at some point replacing it with another summoner, or letting junglers have access to another interesting summoner to make up for that deficit. Because obviously, from a coolness perspective, it's kind of lame that we've nerfed Smite on champions to the point where it doesn't really feel like a real summoner anymore. And that's probably appropriate because it both has a much lower cooldown and also does other stuff, besides just hitting champions. But from a feels perspective, I could definitely understand the complaint of like as a jungler, my summoners feel worse than as a laner. I think that's a very reasonable complaint. Anyway, hopefully that's a good answer to this question, which I just spent a bunch of time on, and I probably should have had in the previous video instead if I had just not cut it. But that's neither here nor there. Let's move on. So this is another one I put at the top of the queue because it's kind of follow up to a question I was talking about in the previous one where I was talking about Aurelion Sol and Conqueror, and how this, one of the scary things about that is that it might lead to a very tanky build. And the thing is, I don't know actually the exact wording of what I said, but when I said like a tanky build, I was not talking about literally ASol goes full tank with Conqueror. What I was talking about here was a build like a Mumu's, where a Mumu goes Liandry's with Conqueror into tank items and has been doing builds like that for the past, 6 years now. Zach has had similar builds where he's going for, it's sometimes with Aftershock, but in lane, he's often going for like 1 or 0 damage items with Conqueror and still dealing a lot of damage. That's the scary thing is like ASol as an example. We don't want him to be going things like, hey, you go Liandry's, you go Rylai's, and you go tank in the rest of your slots as his default build. I think if that's a build that's very situationally good, that could be okay. But the risk of making something like Conqueror really powerful on Aurelion Sol is that we'd potentially be risking making a build like that the default, and the expectation for Aurelion Sol in a game is that if the game goes past like 25 minutes, that he's actually going to be very high durability. That doesn't really support the pattern that we want for Aurelion Sol, which is that he is a champion that has to take risks to deal damage, right? That's the scary thing with a lot of these champions that we give powerful damage scaling to, especially like non-ratio skewed damage, is if they don't actually have to build any damage to, or build a lot of damage to deal a lot of damage, some of the core gameplay around their kit starts to break down, where it's like, oh, well, part of Aurelion Sol's kit is supposed to be that interrupting his Q actually means something in a team fight. But if he's a tank or a high durability champion because he built 2 tank items and he out of his 4 items that he has, a lot of that gameplay around like interrupting his Q and making sure that he doesn't just fly into the middle of your team with no risk being taken. It's like a lot of that gameplay breaks down. But the concern that I was making here was not literally he takes Conqueror and goes full tank, or goes like Conqueror and goes only Liandry's or anything like that. I'm not too concerned about that in particular. I'd be more concerned about like Conqueror, Liandry's, Rylai's into tank items being the default build, being a concern. Not that it like would ever be possible, because I think there's actually games on live right now where you could take a look at ASol and say, actually, this is a game where you should be going something like Rylai's, Liandry's, or Liandry's, Rylai's into, say like an Abyssal Mask or something like that. And I think that's okay if it's a situational build that is usually not optimal, but is situationally sometimes good. That could be okay. But the risk is always with default builds, with things like this, not necessarily the situational ones. Moving on to thoughts on crit items having homogenized crit chance. So I talked a little bit about this, I think, in the last, number 9, where, there's enough headroom for crit items. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I've tested systems where there wasn't homogenized crit chance. I think there's maybe some merit to that, something we could explore further in the future. This having been said, I think that these systems where you don't end up with weird amounts of crit chance are generally superior, right? Like I don't particularly like, for example, the system where Static Shiv has a smaller amount of crit than Phantom Dancer, and that is one of the things that differentiates your second item, is that PD is greedier because it has more crit chance and it's more of a multiplier for your late game DPS. That part I don't think is particularly compelling to me. Around, I have hit 85% crit chance because I have PD, whereas I would have, 75 or 65 or whatever, right? Whatever the number is, because you have a lesser crit item, and that being one of the differentiators. I don't really love that aspect of things. And so I think largely I'm a fan of crit being breakpointed into, you hit these certain thresholds, whether that's 20, 40, 60, or whether that's 25, 50, 75. That part I'd actually like, because I think it makes it much more clear what crit is doing for you, and what, like, when you're supposed to spike and when you're not, like when you're supposed to be powerful and when you're not supposed to be powerful. Because I think part of the problem with the weirdly segmented crit systems that we had prior to the Mythic system was that it was often unclear, like, hey, this AD carry has BT, Shiv, BF Sword, and this other one has Infinity Edge, Phantom Dancer, and which one of these AD carries is stronger is very unclear, right? Because, well, BT is a slightly cheaper item and it doesn't have crit on it, and Shiv has less crit on it, but they have an extra component because even if they're the same gold, it's often very unclear which of those builds was more powerful at equivalent amounts of gold when the crit chance is very strange. I think that there's a lot better clarity around when a given crit champion is strong and like how they're going to spike when the crit system's crit chance is homogenized. And this hasn't really caused problems in terms of us being able to tune the items, for example. We've never really run into problems where like, oh man, I really wish I could, up or down the crit chance on this item because I don't have other levers. So we've always been able to find other levers for the items to be able to change them to do what we want them to do. I don't think that has actually been a problem in the crit system at all. And so the only thing that I would consider to be a potential problem here is like, well, if everything is homogenized, can you tune the items? Has never really manifested. That kind of makes me say, hey, yeah, I think this is as a system has been working pretty well since we introduced Mythics. This part of the crit system is of all of the crit items having, similar thresholds of crit chance has been working. Though that doesn't necessarily mean that I think the crit system itself has been working, but I don't think that the crit system, in my opinion, has really ever been great. I don't think there's any example of any crit system that we've ever had in League of Legends that I would call one of our like top 3 item system, like top 3 item like class systems. Yeah, I think that's probably true. So yeah, I think crit could be better for sure. All right. So this is another one. Why is complexity in the item system seen as such a net negative? And I think this is partially just due to the way that I present it. And the answer is it's not, right? There is a difference between a negative and a cost, right? Complexity is a cost that we pay on items, on some items, not all of them, right? Shadow Flame, as an example, is a very simple item. But complexity is a cost that we pay. And I talk about complexity a lot, especially when I stream, when people pitch me, random ideas for items or random pitches for items of like, oh, how could this be changed? And a lot of times I will discount a lot of things immediately by saying, I don't think this would be worth the complexity. And I want to be clear here. It's like, I don't know how I say this every single time, but I want to be clear about the way that I frame this is worth the complexity is complexity is a cost that we pay, not necessarily a net negative in all situations. In fact, I believe that the item system should have a certain level of complexity. As an example, I think the item system should be meaningfully more complex than the item system that League of Legends started out with. If you look at League's item system today, comparatively to the item system that it had in 2013 in Season 3, the item system is probably like 3 or 4 times more complex, somewhere, significant up complexity, because not only do we have significantly more complex items on average, right? We do still have some simple items, but most of our items are meaningfully more complicated than they were back then. But also we have significantly more items, and each additional item is additional complexity for the system. And essentially, the reason why we care about complexity as a cost, and we don't bloat this forever, is that it is actually extremely important to the core gameplay loop of League of Legends that someone can look at a build and intuit what a champion is going to do with that build, right? As an example, let's say you see a Kayle with Trinity Force. You've probably never seen one of those before, or at least not in a long time. If if you've played League for the past 16 years, maybe you've seen 1 or 2 of those in your time. But you probably haven't seen a Kayle with Trinity Force in many years, right? But you can pretty quickly intuit what's going to happen if you see a Kayle with Trinity Force. The item itself, you understand what the item does. And you've seen Trinity Force on a bunch of other champions. You've seen Trinity Force on Jax. You've seen Trinity Force on Ezreal. You know what's going to go down when you see a Kayle with Trinity Force, even though you've never seen that before. That's really important to the structure of League of Legends, that you can understand what's going to happen. And in some cases, even after you are killed by someone or after you interact with someone, that you can understand why what happened the way that it did, right? This is an AP Varus thing. Obviously, AP Varus has gotten a lot more popular, but like if you go back in time to before, when AP Varus was, more of an off meta, more unknown thing that people weren't doing very much, you could die to AP Varus, R into like auto attacking you some and, one-shotting you, because this is before his R applied blight, of course. But you could die to that, and then you could, sort of understand, you look at his items and you say, oh, the blight stacks are doing damage. He's scaling the damage on his blight stacks. That's why he has Nashor's Tooth to attack me more quickly. If you know what Varus's kit does, you can look at the items and understand okay, that's what's happening. The danger of our item system becoming too complex, which I often talk about in terms of number of items, but also I think applies to the average complexity of items, is if you can't understand what people's item builds do, the game becomes very incomprehensible and you can't understand what you're supposed to do differently in the game. You're not going to be able to understand like, oh, I just died to Varus in this way that I don't understand because I don't understand his items. And then therefore I don't understand the game and I don't understand how I'm supposed to get better. And one of the core tenets of League of Legends, one of the reasons why League is such an awesome game, is that you always feel like you're getting better at stuff and you're learning things. There's always things to learn. Every single game you're learning. This is why League is such an awesome game and why the MOBA structure is so amazing, is that there's always new things to learn, right? The games are so different from game to game that ultimately you're not able to recreate the exact same situations that you go into game from game to game, right? Variance is such a core part of the game, and when you have a game that's so high variance, it's really important that there are certain pillars that people can cling to and can understand to be able to uh, learn from the actions that occurred in the game how they're supposed to do things differently in the future, and how they were supposed to play differently, and how they're supposed to approach the situation differently. And a huge part of that is being able to understand quickly and efficiently what a given item does and what an item build does on a given champion. And so the scary thing as we increase the complexity of the item system year over year is not about new players necessarily, right? Like obviously at some point we make an item system that people don't even want to learn. Maybe that's a downside, but that's not really what I think of as when I think of complexity in the item system. When I think of complexity in the item system, the thing that scares me is at some point we'll cross a threshold upon which people can't intuit what items are doing on given champions anymore. And when we cross that threshold, we have lost something crucial to the process of learning how to play League of Legends, which is the process that everyone does every game that makes League a really fun game to play for most of its player base, right? That's part of what makes League really fun. And so it's always risky every time we up complexity because the game becomes less understandable and therefore less learnable, right? And so we're always walking this fine line because part of the way that we make the game more interesting and add new things to learn for players is we add complexity, right? And so one of the dangers here is that we have to add complexity over time because the players master the existing systems and they learn, and so we're kind of forced to up complexity in some ways. This is what led to the birth of like feats of strength, for example. It's like, hey, what if we gamified part of our game? We added like a mini game to First Blood, First Turret. We gamified this. There's it's more complex, and now there's something to learn here and to do. We ended up deciding that complexity wasn't worth it, right? That it was too complex for the value, which I think is fair, right? It was replacing like essentially, it's an entire mini game replacing essentially like 300-ish gold worth of power. Is that really worth it? But this is something where we have to ride a line here that's pretty careful in the item system, where I have generally, I think, increased a lot of the complexity in the item system since I simplified it a lot in Season 14, right? Since Season 14, I've added a lot of items and reworked a lot of items to make them more complicated. And I think that was worth it, and I think it was the right thing to do. But we have to be careful about where we spend our sort of complexity bucks. If you think of this as a currency that we have to spend per year, that's why we think of it as a cost, because we can only add so much complexity before the game becomes unlearnable, or the game becomes incomprehensible, and then the game isn't fun, right? If it's not learnable, because part of the key thing that makes League fun is people are learning every game. So hopefully that's a good answer. I feel like I kind of spun around there for a little bit, so apologies if I kind of like rambled on and like circled back to my own point a little bit. Sorry if that's how it looked, because I think that's kind of what it was. So apologies. But I'm not going to re-record this because I don't want to. So we're going to move on. Thoughts on Rakan going other roles, AP, tank, etc., good or bad for the game? This one's interesting. We've seen some AP Rakan over the years in mid lane. I don't know if it's ever actually been good. I don't think I've ever looked at any win rate data for this. I've literally no clue if it's ever been good or not. I think that the thing with Rakan that I'm going to draw some parallels to the original Rel here. One of the things that we found with the original Rel that like led to us not wanting to, to even try to encourage her in a solo lane, and in fact led to us like actively discouraging people from playing her in a solo lane, was that when you have a champion who has a spell that literally doesn't work without an ally, we generally don't want to encourage that champion to lane because they often feel incomplete to players, right? There's like all these awkward like optimizations around, hey, I want my jungler to gank me more because I have a spell that literally doesn't work unless they come gank for me. And then that puts, in some cases like undue pressure on your jungler, and it creates a lot of intra-team friction around, hey, I have this spell that literally doesn't do anything unless my jungler comes. My idiot jungler decided to gank another lane. Even if they're successful, often you feel bad about that as the solo lane Rakan player, or in the case I'm talking about, the solo lane Rel that we tested a lot in development. And so I think that's like right off the bat is sort of a red flag to me. Not necessarily to say that we could never do it or that we could never support it, but it's something that seems a little scary to me, where I look at the champion and I say, okay, so you have a spell that only works on allies, and you want this champion to go in a solo lane where they have no allies. Also, they have a spell that like heals in an AoE, and they don't have any allies nearby. Also, they have kind of an incomplete pattern if they don't have an ally nearby. I'm a little skeptical of this, right? And maybe that last one is potentially the most damning one, where the pattern of this champion doesn't really make that much sense. I think it's you W in and you Q them, and you're done. You walk away. That's your pattern as a solo lane Rakan. Is that really a functional pattern? Like, how do we make that better in a way that's actually interesting, right? And so there's a lot of things here that just make me skeptical that this is ever something we'd want to support without giving him like something that his E could do without an ally. And I don't necessarily think that's where support Rakan players would want his power to be. And so that's where I'm kind of skeptical of this, where my suspicion is this is probably just bad for the game if it's good, because we're setting ourselves up with a kit where he has sort of an incomplete pattern in a way that's like likely not going to be super satisfying or interesting if it's functional in the solo lanes. That's my suspicion, right? This is the kind of thing where maybe there's some small change that's totally okay for support that we could do to make this work. Like maybe there's something that his E could do when he's alone that's more interesting. It's the kind of thing where it's like, if I was assigned to do this work, I would not go in thinking it's impossible. But from at a base level, looking at it from on the outside without doing any like significant research, I am kind of skeptical of the idea. But if someone was internally saying like I want to test out a solo lane Rakan change list, I wouldn't say don't do that or like you'll never make that work. I would be saying, okay, I'm interested. Show me what you got. Like show me what your pitch is, right? I think there's some problems to solve, but maybe it could work, right? Like maybe there's something here, because there is something interesting about the idea of Rakan as a carry, right? I think that the way that his spells are structured, I think especially his passive is a really interesting output for a carry. It's like, oh, I have a big, high AP ratio shield that I can refresh if I am able to get, a lot of hits off in combat. It's like, okay, that like we're kind of cooking on that. Like that's cool. I think that could be interesting in a solo lane. So there's some appealing stuff here for sure, but I'm a little suspicious given the fact that his pattern is pretty clearly designed around using his E as your disengage tool. So, could be good, could be bad. All right. Why does Death's Dance ignore pain passive work on both physical and magic damage when Maw only works on magic damage? So, pretty straightforward answer here. It's because Maw is intended to be a relatively narrow counter item for a really strong mage or double or triple AP comps, whereas Death's Dance is intended to be a much broader, much more accessible and usable item, right? There's going to be physical damage in every game. If not the enemy champions, at a bare minimum, there will be turrets and minions, right? Armor is the broader stat, And so Death's Dance is it is intended to be a much more broadly accessible item, right? I don't think I've ever talked about this in my Q&A, and I'm not going to get super in detail on this. If people want to hear about it, you're welcome to ask about it. But in the original structure of the intended structure, I'm not saying this is how it actually played out, because it's not true, but in the intended structure for Death's Dance and Sterak's Gauge, the original versions of those items, Death's Dance was supposed to be the defensive item for the medium and the lighter fighters, and Sterak's was supposed to be the defensive item for Juggernauts, right? That was why the original Sterak's basically said you had to take a lot of damage in a short window, because it was like, well, if you don't have any mobility because you're a Juggernaut, you have to walk in the enemy in a straight line, you're going to take a lot of damage. That's why it scales with bonus health, because we expect Juggernauts to build a lot of bonus health. And the reason why Death's Dance scales with bonus AD is because we wanted that to be oriented towards the more lighter fighters that tend to build heavier on the AD and more damage items throughout their build and so on and so forth, right? They don't buy tank items, etc. And so Death's Dance was originally intended, I think, to be more of a core item for light fighters. And a lot of those light fighters and medium fighters especially ended up moving towards higher health builds that could utilize Sterak's, right? And so some of this structure is sort of what's a good word for this? Sort of vestigial structure around the design intent of the original Death's Dance was that it would be for both the light and the medium fighters, whereas it ended up actually only really being for some of our lighter fighters, and Sterak's ended up covering almost every medium fighter as well as the Juggernauts, and we ended up in this state where we then made Sterak's over the years more and more and more generic and didn't really change Death's Dance, and so they both ended up kind of in this state where they both kind of cover a lot of use cases for the lighter fighters, and some of the light fighters still go for Sterak's anyway. So that's like where we ended up here. I do think that this is the kind of structure that it currently works. I wouldn't necessarily say that it works in the most ideal way possible, but that's ultimately why Death's Dance works on all types of damage, was that it was intended to be the defensive item for light fighters. And so, of course, it had to work on all types of damage. Otherwise, it would have been too situational to serve as the premier headliner defensive item for light fighters. All right, is it time to roll back some of the outcomes of the durability patch? We've kind of done a little bit of this over the years, right? The live pod, if you watch Freak's videos, for example, you'll hear him talk about this from time to time, have generally leaned towards when they're nerfing champions. One of the things that they've been nerfing a lot is armor per level over the years. You can actually just look at our patch notes over the last couple of years and see there's been a lot of armor per level nerfs since the durability patch, because armor growth in particular is one of the things that has encouraged or like made percentage penetration better than it was sort of supposed to be. But it's important that it still has, powerful numbers, because of course it has to counter armor. And so we're in this sort of structural hole where armor scaling is so powerful, and resistance scaling as well. I think MR scaling similarly is pretty high. But we have rolled back some of the outcomes. I will say my personal taste, not saying everyone agrees with this, but my personal take is I think that we probably could increase early lethality a bit back from the durability patch. Specifically, I think especially in mid lane. I think the early game durability stuff did actually really good things for bot lane, where you don't get E'd on by Leona at level 2 and just expect to just instantly die no matter what. But I think mid lane in particular, a lot of assassins feel like it's, they're in this kind of no-win situation where the first time they chunk their opponent, it's very difficult to get that kill, and often they'll just get a summoner, maybe a TP, maybe a flash, and then the second time they do it, they either get that opportunity, or they actually have to use their own summoners or their ultimate on another lane to snowball, because their lane opponent often finishes like a lost chapter or some other item that lets them avoid actually interacting, whether that's a catalyst or a lost chapter or a tier or whatever. And so because the lethality is of mid lane is low, and I'm not talking about the stat, I'm talking about like the actual amount of kills, or like the ability to actually kill people, because the lethality of mid lane is relatively low, especially for these assassin type champions, this has led to them needing to be better at roaming and spiking in ways that maybe aren't the most desirable for all of them, right? Like, as an example, I would love it if Fizz was better at killing you at level 3, right? It used to be that the thing that scared everyone about Fizz was that he was going to kill you at like level 2, level 3. Nowadays, it's, well, he hits level 6, he hits you with a shark, and you probably have to flash, or you maybe die if you misplay that interaction, but it's the second shark that's really threatening for Fizz, right, as an example, right? And oftentimes at that point, you're just playing outside of his shark, outside of his interaction range, or you're playing with summoners, and then okay, so the Fizz just goes bot lane and tries to kill your bot lane instead. And I don't think that's actually super great for anyone. Because the assassin feels like they can't play to their lane, and the bot lane feels like the assassin is always coming to them. So I think there are some things we could do, right? This is something where maybe actually the role quests should come into play here, because I think I like for my personal taste, I think that the durability patch did good things for bot lane, like basically every role except mid, in terms of the early game durability. Late game durability, that one I'm less confident in, like what the exact fallout of that is. But I think that LivePod has done a lot of good work over the years in reducing armor per level, such that not everyone is an Omega tank late game. In terms of, well, Omega tank's an exaggeration, but not everyone is, I think, more durable than they should be. There are still definitely some champions that are outliers that I think are a bit more durable than they should be, but I think we've done some good systemic work to curtail some of the scaling. But I could definitely see some mid lane changes here. At least my personal taste says that. Not everyone agrees. Let's talk about Syndra. So Syndra and how players want to play her, the burst versus her haste build. So this is an interesting one, where I think what we've found over the years is that Syndra as a champion kind of has to play with a fairly low Q cooldown in order for her to feel good, right? We've tried versions of Syndra internally, and even on some patches we had some where Q cooldown was a little longer and we had to revert it because it feels bad. We find that the Syndra's Q cooldown kind of has to be somewhat low in order for her kit to function and feel good. And that gives her some battle magey properties, right? Even though if you look at her kit shape, it kind of looks like this is a burst mage. The actual reality is like, well, this is a burst mage that has some battle mage properties, and then she also happens to have with her QE basically the best pick tool, best basic ability pick tool in the game, right? This is for a mage, I guess I should say, right? It's not Blitzcrank Hook, obviously, but in terms of what mages have to offer, Syndra is actually the best. She has the best tools for picking people off, right? And so this is where we run into issues where her kit feel kind of requires us to keep the cooldown low, and that means that she's going to have some battle mage properties. And then her ultimate says she's a burst mage, but she's not really, because she has all this power budget in having really good pick tools and also having DPS. And so this is what leads to these problems around some Syndra players want to play her as a burst mage, but in actual reality, haste, stacking a bunch of haste on her often ends up being the most effective thing to do, because just getting a second E cast in a single fight is so unbelievably powerful. And so this is something where I don't have a great solution for you. To me, I've said this before in my Q&As, and I'll say it again probably, I'm personally kind of a big hater of Syndra's kit. I actually really dislike the way that her kit is structured. I don't like a lot of the things about her kit. I really dislike that she doesn't have to stand still to cast her spells. I like, it's sort of thematically in line, but I think it's supremely messed up. That's neither here nor there. But what I'm getting at here is basically there are some interlocking kit problems that all tie to either satisfaction of her kit or her core identity, right? And I don't personally have a great solution to these. It is the reality that haste is going to be good on this champion as long as she has the best best mage pick spell in the game, right? QE is just such an incredible spell for picking people off and for team fighting that haste is always going to be very powerful in this champion. It's going to be better than it is on other mages, relatively speaking, because she has the best output for the haste, right? And so that's just going to be true, right? And it's particularly compounded by the fact that she has her Q, which is a battle mage output that, of course, scales really well with haste as well. I do think that it would be nice if we could support a more linear burst build for Syndra. but I don't have a great solution to offer you of like, oh, well, we should just do A, B, and C, right? It's something that we've done a lot of work on in the past. I don't think we've come up with any great solutions. Maybe someone has a good solution for this and I haven't seen it, but I don't personally have anything to offer here. What I'm pointing out is basically just that given her current kit structure, the way that her kit uh, is designed and the way that her kit, her power manifests, she's going to have a good haste build, right? And there's really not much we can do to get away from that unless we wanted to do things that would be very painful, like make her Q cooldown very long, which would then make her W and E probably not feel like particularly real spells, right? Part of the reason why I don't like her kit is because she has kind of what I would call like a fake constraint, right? Oriana's constraint is pretty real, right? She has to play around her ball, and so casting your E on an ally actually has a real cost. You can't use your W on an enemy on the other side of your screen if you ED an ally, right? And so there's real costs to the actions that you take. Syndra, because her Q cooldown is lower, because her kit feels non-functional with a higher Q cooldown, doesn't really have those trade-offs, and so I think that's what leads to a lot of the problems in her kit construction, which I really dislike. I'm not a big fan, but I'm not going to keep talking about it. I think there's not too much else to be said here other than that. Yeah, I think the kit construction is not ideal. All right, Trailblazer, Staff Flowing Water, and Abyssal Mask feeling weak. Um, I don't know what the factual power state of all three of these items. I didn't bother looking before this because I think I'm just going to talk about the satisfaction around these. Like, yeah, I think Staff could, we could maybe return the movement speed on Staff of Flowing Waters or some other secondary effect. But ultimately, I think this item was made. I mean, the item was obviously made to support enchanters being good with mages and having more flexibility. I don't think it's really ever felt like it did that. And maybe that's just due to the AP feeling too invisible. This is the kind of thing where I could definitely believe that what we're actually supposed to do is have some sharper version of Staff where maybe it milio passives your allies and it makes them feel good about having spells, right? And maybe it has like 3 charges of milio passive where, oh, their next 3 spells do something really cool. And so therefore it feels good with mages and less good with AD carries. And that's what makes it interesting. There's maybe some things we could do to get more targeted at the original purpose of Staff, but I think the one of the big differences between Staff and Ardent is that your AD carry can feel like attack speed is the most feelable stat in League of Legends, and so you have not only the most feelable stat, but also something you can literally see, which is magic damage on hit. And so the Ardent Sensor, like I think part of what makes Ardent Sensor a really successful item and Staff a very unsuccessful one, even though they have a very similar paradigm, is that the things that Staff gives are just so much less satisfying and less visible. And so maybe there's work that we could do there. Trailblazer is one where I've talked about this before, but I think the failing of Trailblazer was that I made this item in a world where we were very accepting of supports opting into roaming. And the same season that we added Trailblazer to the game, grubs were made. And this led to a significant spike in supports roaming, especially very early on in the game. And this led to us wanting to curtail support roaming pretty significantly, and then us leading to a position where basically since season 14, we've wanted to discourage supports from roaming and make it less optimal to roam overall, especially early on in the game. And Trailblazer only really makes sense if it's a cheap first item spike that's designed to help you, just to support you roaming around the game a lot. And so we've never really let Trailblazer be a really strong tank support item, which I think has led to it being kind of awkward and kind of orphaned in the system. I think there are things we could do to improve it, but I think honestly, systemically, one of the things that we could do to help this out was something like the role quest that has its own way of limiting support roaming in the early game to what we're comfortable with. And maybe in the modern day, we can be more okay with a stronger Trailblazer. Abyssal Mask, I think, is just kind of a problematic item. I don't think I've really been personally happy with any version of Abyssal Mask. It's just an item that's really not that satisfying. Like, it's doubly narrow, right? It requires you to be against a lot of magic damage to make it worth building MR, right? Because MR is already a relatively narrow stat, and then on top of that, it also needs your team to have a lot of magic damage that you value the magic amp from, and that's just like doubly situational items like that are just very hard to make work. And they need really satisfying passives. And this is a doubly situational item that has a deeply unsatisfying like numbers passive that you can't see or feel very well. So this is the kind of thing where I think there's been versions of this that we've tested before that I thought were pretty cool. Like there was a version that pulsed waves of like MR shred out. Obviously, we can't do that now because we have Bloodletter's Curse. But there's been versions of this item that I thought were pretty compelling. And so maybe there's a rework to Abyssal Mask that could make it feel better. But there have been lots of versions of Abyssal Mask that have been factually quite powerful that people just didn't buy because they don't feel that good. And it's super situational, right? Doubly situational items are just, it's a tough spot. It's a tough thing to make feel good. So that's kind of my read on these three items. Ultimately, I think that these three items could all be better. I think that work on all of these three items could definitely be something that we could do in the future. All right, Udyr buffs are a miss. Why not buff health growth? So let's talk about base stats. This is a really interesting topic. I'm not going to talk specifically about the Udyr buffs. I pitched that we could do I pitched both the Q rank up incentive and something on W to buff specifically AD Udyr. So I'm not going to talk specifically about like why do those over other things. But what we're gonna. But let's talk about base stats though, and like why Udyr's health per level is low. Now, again, I want a disclaimer before I get into this. I'm not claiming that Udyr's health per level is perfect, or that it's right for his exact tuning state. Right? Maybe it is too low. But the reason why certain champions like Udyr, like Singed, and like Nunu have very low health per level and just generally very poor stat growths for their class is to encourage the behavior, or like to get them both the build structure that we want and to get the behavior that we want, like the decision structure. For Udyr specifically, as an example, actually, let's do Nunu first. So for Nunu, as an example, the reason why Nunu has terrible base stats and stat growths is because he has some really, really, really powerful defensive effects on his kit, and he also has a lot of CC, right? He has a lot of very reliable CC, right? His E is very easy to land. It slows you and then it roots you, right? It slows you a lot. His W is a very large slow. His R is a very large slow. His W is a fairly reliable knockup at longer range, and it's a very powerful spell in general. So he has a lot of defensive or CC that can be applied defensively, and then he also has multiple defensive steroids. He has a giant heal on his Q, and he has a shield on his R. And so the way that we make it so that Nunu has to use his defensive tools well in order to survive is by saying your stats growths are bad. If you use your CC defensively and you don't use your defensive mechanics super well, you'll just die anyway because you aren't super tanky, right? Singed, we want it to be very clear. We want to make it so that his ultimate can give him an enormous amount of durability. And so one of the things that we can do to siphon power away from his kit and also make it so that he's killable when he doesn't have his ult on is have him have very low health per level, and then let his ultimate defenses be extremely powerful so that he can be very tanky with his ultimate on. But when his ultimate is down, you have a window of opportunity to attack him. And this then gives the Singed player a lot of agency over when they want to interact versus when they don't, and when they get to make decisions around their ultimate, because they're the person that controls when the ultimate button is hit. And so this essentially gives the Singed player more agency in when they're tanky and when they're going to use their durability button, because the durability button is more powerful. Now, with Udyr specifically, the reason why his health per level and his health growth is so bad is to encourage the choice structure that we want around his different spells, right? His W comes at the cost of not using your other spells, right? Udyr is a very different champion. This applies a little bit to Sona, but mostly to Udyr. Because of the global cooldown on Udyr's spells, and the way that he's limited in how much he's actually able to attack champions and champion combat, via his passive and the refunds and all of that stuff. Every time Udyr uses a spell, that means that he's not using another spell, right? He's actually limited in that way, in a way that other champions are not. And so it actually is really important that Udyr feels pressure to use his W to survive. Now, again, disclaimer, I'm not saying that the way that his kit is tuned right now is perfect, or that he has the exact perfect structure of decision making around his W, E, and R and Q and all of that, right? But the intent of him having lower baseline defenses than other champions that are in his similar, that build similarly to him and have similar kit structures to him, is that we want his W to be a really powerful button that not only feels good to press, but also actually feels like it's worth using over his E and his R. And the same is also true for the Empowered WW. It's really important that that spell is actually useful in some cases. Now, my personal take, I suspect that they're probably, like WW in particular, I think is probably a little bit too good relative to the other spell, like the other Empowered spells. Um, but that's why he has bad health growth. It's because we want his W to be something that is actually worth trading off on his other spells with. That's something that you feel like you have to use in situations where your life is in danger, right? Where you have to make decisions around when you're going to use your W and when you're going to get block the most damage from it, and when you're going to use WW as opposed to getting more damage or the unstoppability on E or whatever, right? And so that's where this comes from. Now, whether his exact health growth right now is the perfect number, I don't know, right? Maybe it's too low. I don't know. But that structure is why he has bad health growth, and why we do this sort of base stat differential, and like why we sometimes have weird base stats on champions is sometimes that's necessary to get them to build the things that we want and do the things that we want and have the decision structure that we want them to have. And I think it's really important for Udyr that you actually feel good about pressing all of your different buttons. And so therefore, we can't let him have the same level of baseline durability as other champions that like other juggernauty champions, because he has a spammable defensive button that we need you to feel good about, and we need to actually put pressure on you to use that button, or his entire kit structure doesn't really make sense. And so that's where the stats come from. As another sort of example that I was just thinking of like weird stats being used to structure a kit the way that we want, take a look at Zeri's base stats on the wiki. She actually gets a lot of health per level. She has really bad resistances. That one's kind of interesting because we use it to discourage her from building health, because of course health scales linearly with itself and it multiplies with your resistances. And so by giving her bad resistance growths but good health per level, we make it so that building items like Titanic Hydra is worse on her, or are worse on her, right? Because the health itself isn't providing as much durability as it would if she had less health per level and more resistances per level, as an example. But these kinds of weird stat growths are things that I think a lot of people just look at a champion's stat growths on the wiki and say, that's lower than most champions in their class, or they're the lowest in class. That means that they're bad at this thing. It doesn't mean that Udyr is the least durable champion. It's part of the reason why he gets to have a really powerful W is because he has bad health growth, right? That's part of the trade-off. And so just something to keep in mind when you're looking at stats on the wiki is that the stats are not the whole story ever with any champion. Everything on a champion is all relative to their kit as a whole and the items that they build. Everything in League is relative, really, right? Like you can't even look at an item outside of the context of the champions that build it, right? And so because of that, because everything is relative to the context of the kit that it's in or the champions that build it or whatever, you have to consider everything in that context. And Udyr is not functionally just zero durability because he has bad health growth. He has a really powerful defensive spell that we want to feel good and be powerful and have appropriate decision making around, and therefore he gets bad health growth. That's why. Okay, apologies for the quick cut in here, but I started answering this question originally, like when I was doing the previous recording of the video. It was pretty late at night, and I got to this question, started answering it, and was thinking, is anything I'm saying even making sense? Maybe I should just go to sleep. I'm kind of tired, so I just did that, and I'll cut this my original answer to this out, and then I'll continue from here. So let's get on with it, talking about the can Kayle get true damage waves at level 20 question. So let me separate this into two questions about specifically Kayle true damage waves and mechanics at level 20, because I think these are actually separate topics. Let's talk about mechanics at level 20 first. This is something I've touched upon a little bit previously when I was talking about Camille getting scaling for like higher levels and things like that. I'm generally not a fan of this idea of mechanically changing champions at levels above 18, even if they are primary top laners, even if we expect that's their main or their only role, for a number of different reasons. For one, while I think the top lane quest, like the quest system in general, the role quest system has been really nice, It's only been out for 2.5 months now, and there's no guarantees that we're going to keep it, especially not keep it in its exact current form, right? We might decide the role quest system is great, but we want to change the top lane quest reward to something else. We also might decide, hey, this top lane quest reward of level cap is really cool. What if we want to do level cap in other systems, right? And have it affect, intersect there. And basically, this is sort of changing mechanics significantly uh, at higher level, or sorry, at overcapped levels, I think is dangerous because we are opening ourselves up to a lot of future risk and a lot of future extra extra sort of friction on changing systems, right? This is the exact problem that we ran into with Cassiopeia and her boots passive, and I think some other designers didn't like it for other reasons, but the core reason why we changed the Cassiopeia no boots passive was because multiple years in a row we ran into this situation where we were working on these systems that were tied to boots and saying, hey, we're going to have to spend a bunch of time doing extra work on Cassio if we want to ship this system. And so we're essentially signing ourselves up for a lot of extra work when we have these, or a lot of potential extra work in the future when we do these types of things. And as I've made before, there's a distinction between strong and weak systemic ties, right? I would call the, or I guess like hard and soft. I don't know what I'm sort of inventing terminology here, right? This isn't like real terminology anyone's using, but like what I would call like a soft and a hard binding here, where the Cassiopeia is a hard binding, right? If you do something specifically with the boots, then you kind of have to account for Cassiopeia because you can't buy them at all, right? Conversely, you look at something like Kaisa, and she has a soft systemic tie where it's, okay, look, yes, changing the item system might affect Kaisa getting to her evolve breakpoints, but it's just a number you can change, and so it's not that big of a deal. And most of the time when you change the item system, it's probably not going to matter too much for Kaisa anyway. It might change her build, right? Because you changed an item by 5 AD or whatever, or 10 AP or whatever the case might be. 10% AS, et cetera, et cetera. But it's not going to be a huge thing where you're going to have to spend, number one, you don't have to spend that much time considering it. And number two, the impact, if you do or don't consider it, is not that high, right? Whereas Cassio, had we not changed her passive, literally would not work with the mid or bot lane quest at all, which is not acceptable for a champion, right? And so that's a problem, I think, where I think these kinds of hard systemic ties don't make sense for us to sign ourselves up for. But the soft ones I'm a particularly big fan of. I think they can be very cool. Like, again, the Kaisa Evolve example, I think, is a really awesome one that we have on live that works really well. So specifically speaking to mechanics at level 20, I'm not really a fan of the idea. I think that numbers tuning is totally reasonable, right? Like as an example, let's suppose we take Darius and we decide for whatever reason, hey, Darius at level 19 and 20 is just getting too much power. We think he's too much better. When he gets his passive stacked, he's too much AD. We want to tune that? Sure, right? And so from Kayle perspective, if we want to make Kayle scale better at level 20 for whatever reason, and so therefore we want to say, like, I don't actually know off the top of my head if like what on Kayle scales with level, but like suppose that her wave damage, base damage scales with level. I don't actually know if that's true. I don't know off the top of my head. But if it did, we could implement a step function such that, hey, normally you get 3 damage per level or whatever it is if it has level scaling. Again, I still don't even know. But actually at levels 19 and 20, you're going to get 10. Boom, you actually scale better with 19 and 20, and that's something that we don't really have to worry about pinning us in significantly or signing ourselves up for significant extra work in the future if we do ever decide to either change the results of the top quest, remove the top quest, add other sources of overcapping levels, like those kinds of things. From just from a systemic perspective, I don't think that it makes sense to add new mechanics to champions at 19 and 20 unless they can get there on their own, right? Like as an example, if we made a new champion whose whole thing was I have no level cap and I get, powerful bonuses at different level breakpoints, sure, that's their thing, right? They can of course do that because they can get there on their own. They don't need a system's help in order to enable them to access that part of their kit, right? Another thing like I would consider here also that I would say is like an additional layer here is that I don't actually think this makes sense for Kayle, right? Kayle's passive says when you rank up your ultimate, you get these bonuses. When you hit level 20, you're not ranking up your ultimate, right? On Kayle, you're not getting any extra skill points, right? Most champions don't unless you're Udyr, right? And so I don't actually think there's any connection here. And so I think even from a champion benefits and a champion sort of sense making perspective, I don't think it makes sense to give Kayle a bonus at level 20 because she's not ranking up her ultimate. Now, I think if we did have, as an example, a system that let you rank up your ultimate in additional time, I think the argument would be a lot stronger there that maybe it would be worth spending the time and effort to have that systemic tie. But that's not what we're talking about here, right? Like we're talking about this is a level scaling thing, and Kayle sort of vaguely scales with level, though she scales with specific levels that this is not giving. Now let's talk about the Kayle true damage. And I'll give some disclaimers here that I personally, as a player, preferred the more extreme version of Kayle, the original VGU version, where she got range at level 11 and had those true damage waves. True damage conversion is really powerful, right? It's just factually a lot of extra damage, and it's also counterplay removing, right? And one of the things that I think that is something I don't like about the idea of a low percentage chance of Kayle getting a lot of true damage conversion is it is counterplay changing. And in general, I've talked about this before. I think actually Quacks might have a short up right now of me talking about this in relation to like Ornn breaking terrain and stuff. But in general, my design perspective or like my sort of design philosophy around mechanics is if something changes the counterplay or like changes the way that players should the enemies should act in some way, right? In this case, as an example, let's suppose you're playing against double AP. You're thinking about whether you want to buy a Maw or a Sterax. Against a Kayle, you're probably supposed to buy the Sterax most of the time because your Maw is actually going to be quite bad if she ever gets to her true damage waves, as an example, right? Like there's some small counterplay differences, and there's like some actual things that you would do differently. And in general, I think if we're asking players to do something differently, like in response to an opponent's mechanic, I think that mechanic needs to be either very well communicated, number one, or number two, it needs to be common enough that players can learn it even without strong communication, right? As an example, I've seen people talk about things like, cool interactions in this way, like, oh, Nunu porting, getting ported by Rise. I think this is actually a fairly learnable mechanic. You get hit by it one time and you understand sort of like what happened. Even if you don't understand what happened, you can see in the future, hey, there's a person porting in from a Rise portal. I should probably be careful about that because last time I died, or last time I got chunked for a bunch of damage, or whatever. And that's why it's learnable. It'll happen to you likely multiple times per game when people are engaging in that combo, right? If they're actually opting into it. And so it's learnable. The thing with level 20 mechanics especially, but just like really low percentage mechanics that change counterplay is that they're not very learnable because you buy you buy the Maw, you die to the Kayle while your Maw shield is on you and like, what the hell? Why did that happen? And then the game ends and you're probably not going to think about that 50 games in the future the next time you see another Kayle that hits this high level breakpoint that gives her true damage waves. However, like I said in my disclaimer, I personally liked the sharper version of Kayle. It is really powerful to get true damage waves, and that's part of why we don't have it on the current Kayle, is that we wanted to put that power elsewhere. But I personally would be in favor of doing a re-sharpening of Kayle, but I think that it is debatable whether that's actually good for her current audience or not, and whether she should be this ultimate, true maximal hyperscaler that we could possibly make type of thing. I think it's debatable whether the current version or the previous version is better. The current version is a little more popular and is, I think, a little more well liked, but provides a little bit less to the game in terms of strategic depth, right? Because she's not offering as extreme an experience. And so there's upsides and downsides to both versions. I think ultimately, I agree the true damage waves were cool, but when I look at the state of the game and the state of Kayle as a whole, I don't see an easy way to get them into the game that makes sense. And I especially do not think the idea of giving her true damage waves at level 20 makes sense. So that's sort of my conclusion here on this question. Why do pets give gold when killed? There's a couple of different things going on here. I'll talk about sort of the typical case, which is like regular pets talking about like Malzahar voidlings and Zyra plants and Yorick ghouls, and then the tankier pets, which are like Tibbers and Daisy, right? The general answer to this question is that it is a satisfaction, it is a mild satisfaction up, and it is a a really big difference psychologically between I killed this thing and I got nothing, and I killed this thing and I got a basically irrelevant reward. The example case I'm going to give from many, many, many years ago is we were testing a version of Zombie Ward internally. I think this might have been when we were creating the original Zombie Ward, though I don't remember at this point. It's a long time ago. But when we were working on this version of Zombie Ward, the original version didn't give any gold. And people would get pretty frustrated. There was a lot of feedback I remember seeing in our feedback documents around, I hate interacting with these zombie wars. Everyone playing against zombie would be like, I hate this. I have to attack this thing. I don't get anything out of it. It's just annoying that these things are littering the map. And the designer did something I think was actually pretty clever. They put 1 gold as a reward on the zombie wards, and that feedback didn't go away completely, but it got reduced pretty significantly. Like just that small psychological difference of I hit this thing and I got 1 gold versus I hit this thing and I got literally nothing actually helped people feel a lot better about interacting with those zombie wards. And the pets are pretty similar, especially a lot of the squishier pets. What we're doing is essentially giving you a reward for engaging in the counterplay that we want you to engage in. We're saying, hey, when you get E'd by Yorick and a bunch of ghouls jump on you, what you're supposed to do is kill the ghouls, right? Like you can kill them. You can auto attack while kiting backwards, and you can kill the ghouls. You can do that. Here, have a reward for doing it, so that you have a good motivation to start learning that sort of play counterplay loop. That's good, right? And that's the experience that we want, even if that gold reward is largely not particularly relevant for the lower amount of gold pets, right? Where it's like, well, I don't know how much gold your ghouls give, or like random like gangplank barrels or whatever. I guess I don't know if gangplank barrel really counts as a pet, but they're not giving you very much gold, right? Over the course of the entire laning phase against most pet champions, I don't know how much gold you're getting, but it's probably less than 100 most of the time. It's really not a whole lot of value, especially because hitting those pets will often mean that you're not hitting a CS, like you miss like 1 or 2 CS because you're hitting the pets instead. So, it ends up being like still probably gold positive for the person killing a lot of the pets, but not as much as you might expect. The tankier pets, though, I think are a little different. I think the tankier pets like Tibbers and Daisy still give 50 gold. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that that's still the case. And the reason for that is that we want to reward your time investment, right? The assumption is that if you spent the time and potentially cooldowns, potentially mana, potentially resources on killing something like a Daisy or a Tibbers, we want you to feel like that time was worth it, instead of just walking directly away and going and hitting some CS or whatever, going and farming a wave. We want you to feel like it was actually worth hitting the Tibbers or the Daisy, because otherwise there's a lot of situations where if they don't give any gold as a reward, it's just hitting them is just a complete waste of your time, and you should just never do it. I don't necessarily, I'm not going to sit here and tell you necessarily like the exact amount of gold they give right now is the perfect amount. It could be higher, it could be lower. I don't really have a super strong opinion on that. But the idea is that they're worth more gold because, or that the gold amount is roughly scaled to the amount of effort it takes to actually get rid of this thing, and like the amount of resources that we expect you to invest, and the amount of resources we expect you to be giving up in order to actually trade out and kill that thing. And so that's why they're worth more gold. Is that they do have that they do have that ask in terms of resource investment to actually kill them, which the most of our pets do not, right? Like things like Yorick ghouls that die in 1 auto attack, or Zyra plants that die in 1 or 2 auto attacks if you're ranged, etc. Right? So that's why gold pet is or pet gold reward is in the game. Mostly it's just yeah, it feels good for the person killing them, and gets them into the feedback loop that we want them to be in, like the loop of understanding that we want them to be in. And the person playing with the pets largely isn't going to notice that gold most of the time, right? It's not feelable that your opponent's got 3 gold or 10 gold or whatever for killing your random pet. Okay, so now let's talk about spell effects in Swain R1. This is a relatively longer topic, and I actually, when I was looking at this one, I went down here to this question, which is not the same question, but is related. Like I think they're very overlapping questions about how much champ power is tied up in applying spell effects, talking about Brand, Zyra, Teemo, Swain, etc. And would they feel better if they didn't apply spell effects and did more damage? And so I'm going to sort of address both, and I crossed that one out preemptively to make sure that I know in the future that I've already talked about this topic. So let's first address the spell effect efficiency modifier. talking about on hit modifiers, right? So if you're not familiar with this, a lot of our spells that apply on hits have an on hit modifier, right? Things like Belveth E, Urgot W, Azir W. They don't apply on hits at 100% effect. They have a reduced effect, which, by the way, only works on damage, which is why Urgot really likes Kayle, because his W doesn't have reduced effect on the healing from Kayle. Only damage on hits are reduced by these effect modifiers. So why have or not have this, right? I would say the core reason why we don't have a spell effect efficiency modifier of like, oh, this spell is really good at applying on these effects, and therefore it only applies Liandry's at half effect or whatever, is because on hits are fundamentally very different from spell effects. For one, the on hit system is an entire fleshed out build path, build system that exists and is an entire method of scaling your auto attack damage, right? This is how Kog'Maw plays the game, and Varus sometimes plays the game, and Vayne usually plays the game. You have an entire build path, an entire set of items that is designed to scale these things, right? We don't have like a Rageblade equivalent, as an example, for spell effects. That's one part of it. I think the bigger part, though, is that on hits fundamentally are indexed against the basic attack, right? Most champion basic attacks are pretty similar. Obviously, we have some outliers, like Zeri, for example, that has a very different basic attack than other champions, like Akshan, for example, who has a different basic attack than other champions in the way that they interact with on hits. But there is a basic attack that we generally, the idea of the basic attack that we know you're going to have roughly, you're going to be attacking a bit less than 1 time per second at level 1. And over the course of the game, if you want to scale your on hits, you're going to buy attack speed, and you'll eventually end, probably somewhere around 2 to 2.5 attacks per second. In an extreme case, you might get up to like 3 attacks per second, right? And when we have spells that apply on hits, one of the things that we look at is like, well, Urgot is applying on hits theoretically. If we want to treat this as an attack, which thematically makes sense, it's just too fast to justify it applying on hits the normal amount, right? Because Urgot W hits 3 times per second, which means that it would be the equivalent of like you have 3 AS at literally level 1, right? Which is obviously insane. It would be an outrageous outlier comparatively to the norm, right? And so because on hits are sort of tuned around the generic basic attack in the game, like the sort of idea of like the basic attack, which obviously is different for every champion, but not by that much. That's why we need this on hit modifier, is because like for these champions, is because we want them to feel like they're attacking, or we want them to index into these systems in some cases, right? Like with Belveth or Azir. We want them to feel good about indexing into these systems, but we want them to actually be tunable relative to the actual basic attack. That's what the purpose of that is there for, right? Is so that these champions can index into these systems, or can be tuned around these systems like Urgot, where we don't actually want him to be buying a bunch of on-hit items, as an example, in ways that make sense for those champions, but also, respect the fact that the basic attack is very different from what they're doing with their spells. There is no equivalent basic spell, though, right? Like, it's not like every champion in the game has access to Mystic Shot, and therefore we tune spell effects around Mystic Shot. Every champion is different. And moreover, because the spell effect system is not an entire system, right? We just have a couple of items that apply spell effects, right? We have Blackfire Torch, we have Liandry's, we have Rylai's, and then we sort of have a couple of others that are like technically maybe adjacent to these systems, but, like I would say are not really there. It's like you could maybe say that Bloodletter's Curse is there, I guess. But I personally wouldn't. I think it's kind of a different beast. But anyway, this is not an entire linear system that is supporting a specific type of champion, right? It's basically, hey, are you good at applying spell effects to a lot of champions with high uptime? And there's a bunch of different ways you can do that. Whereas the typical on-hit champion is, do you attack a lot? And do you have your own on-hit effect, as an example, is like more of a question of like, are you going to get into the on-hit system, right? And so because we're lacking in this sort of linear build path of items that we want, champions to have or not have access to, and because there is no basic spell for us to tune around, I don't really think the idea of a spell effect efficiency modifier makes a lot of sense in League. Now, I'm going to make a comparison here that might be hard to read for some people if you haven't played Risk of Rain 2. But Risk of Rain 2 and a number of other games like it have this idea of a proc coefficient. So the idea of this is that the base proc coefficient of like a normal ability is 1. And in cases where you want to have an ability that hits really frequently and you have a lot of proc effects in your game, this is like 10% chance to deal 100 extra damage or whatever, you make your proc coefficient lower on abilities that hit more frequently. For Risk of Rain 2, this is like Multi's Nail Gun, for example, which I don't know how many times it hits per second, but it's a lot, right? And so the thing with Risk of Rain 2, the reason why the proc coefficient makes sense in that game is that in Risk of Rain 2, you don't have a lot of agency over what items you end up with. You have some, right? You can choose like sometimes the rarity or the general type of item, right? Maybe you want to pick attack items on multi because you want more damage. Maybe you get to a three-way terminal and you get to choose between, an ATG and 2 other items that you don't want as much or whatever, right? But ultimately, you don't have very much agency over the total items that you end up with in your pool in Risk of Rain 2. And so it's actually pretty important that not every game is just you wading through a sea of items that feel useless on your survivor, right? They want the items in that game to generally be useful, even if there's going to be best case users, and there will still be some outlier items that are completely useless on most characters, right? Like Bungus, for example, is largely an engineer only item because no one in that game stands still except the turrets, right? Which get your items and therefore actually take a lot of advantage of the Bungus standstill effect, right? But the proc coefficient is there so that they can tune those items to not be useless on the survivor, like the characters in Risk of Rain 2 that aren't very good at applying proc effects. And the thing with the League of Legends item system is, in the League of Legends item system, you control what you click in the shop. I think in a world where we were making a arena-style prismatic item system where we expect, we want lots of champions to have access to those items, right? And you can look at the arena prismatic items as some of the things that you would do in that world, with like adaptive force, etc. It would make a lot more sense to have a system where you have a much better way of supporting a variety of different champions building the same items, right? So that you make it so that, hey, this item will at least be okay even on its worst users. But we don't care about that because you right click the items in the shop. You choose what you're going to buy. You have complete agency. And what we found in League over the years is that the by far most important thing about the item system is that you feel you as the player and your champion feel good about the items that you're buying. It is not about every champion in the game having access to 15 different builds, right? Some champions, I think, do benefit a lot from that kind of thing, right? Like Shaco, for example, has 2 very different builds, which even in and of themselves have a bunch of build variety, right? There's AD Shaco and there's AP Shaco, and they each both have a bunch of different things that they can buy. And I think that's great for Shaco, right? But I don't actually think it is a primary value that you have total like free choice in the item system, right? And this kind of touches on some of the reasons why the mythic system didn't really work out very well, is that the mythic system traded off, made a lot of sacrifices in order to try and generate that choice. And in some systems that worked, and in some systems it didn't, right? Like obviously there are some item subsystems where the choice structure worked a lot better than others. But even in the systems where it worked, it turned out that having that choice actually wasn't that important to players comparatively to their items feeling good for them, right? And so that's the priority we have for the item system, is that your items feel good for you and that your champion has an item build that feels good for them, right? And so that is why something like a spell effect efficiency modifier I don't think makes a lot of sense for League, is because that is the kind of thing that you would want to do if you wanted to say, well, I want Rylai's to be okay on everyone, right? Like Rammus should be able to build Rylai's and feel good about it. It's like, well, we don't care if Rammus feels good about building Rylai's. And so we're not going to give him a, 7,000 proc efficiency codifier, modifier or whatever on his Q because we want it to be good with, Rylai's and Liandry's or anything like that, right? And so that kind of, I think, summarizes my thoughts on the spell effect efficiency modifier, is that it is a totally fine mechanic given a completely different purpose, comparatively to League's item system. Speaking more specifically to this around like how much power is tied up in applying spell effects, I don't personally have like, oh, it's this amount of, this percentage of win rate, right? It's like, I don't have a good estimation of that. I will say we've gotten kind of mixed results on this over the years. Sometimes we believe a champion is hardbound to an item and we change or remove that item, and that champion actually, in some cases, gets stronger. Or turns out they had another build that was just as good that people just weren't doing. There are some cases where it has come to pass that's like, oh, we took out this item that turned out it was really load bearing for this champion. Like a great example of this from relatively recent times is when we originally removed the Sheen Essence Reaver from the game. Smolder went down, I think, like 3.5% or something like that, because his next best build was that much worse. And there was truly nothing else that he could have. And so we buffed him a lot because of that. And then we had to nerf him a lot when we put Sheen Essence Reaver back in the game. But as another counterexample of the opposite effect, when we removed Gunblade from the game, we assumed that we were going to have to massively buff Katarina and Akali because that was the only thing that they bought. So we buffed both of them, and then we had to immediately nerf both of them quite a lot because it turned out they didn't actually need those buffs at all, and in fact they were probably stronger not building Gunblade in the new item system than they were in the previous one. And so this is just the kind of thing where it's very hard for me to judge. I can't give you a like I definitely can't give you a percentage, and it's hard for me to judge like how much power is there actually in champions like Brand, Zyra, Teemo, Swain, etc. applying, being really good at spell effects or spell effect application. I'm sure it's some, but I can't give you like exactly how much it is. To actually speak to this, like the part of the question is, would they feel better if they didn't apply spell effects and did more damage? The answer to that, I think, is a lot of case to case stuff. Where is your build good for you, and is it satisfying? And when I look at a champion like, say, Teemo, I think the answer is definitively yes. I think Teemo players feel awesome about every item they have, right? Like Teemo is an example of a champion where it's like he just has a ton of items he feels amazing about buying. He loves Nashers. That's awesome for your laning phase. It has a great build path for you. It's awesome to buy Malignance. You get lots of ults. Your ult is really powerful. It's awesome to buy Liandry's. Makes you tankier, and also your R is amazing with Liandry's, and so on. Right? Like he has so many items that he feels amazing about buying, and basically no matter what you buy, you're usually going to be pretty happy about that. And of course, you can't get everything in every game that you might want necessarily, right? And that can feel a little bad, but I think that kind of tension can be good. Conversely, I think you have some other champions that might be a little too dependent upon certain items or just feel really terrible without them. I'm not thinking Swain here specifically, but I'm thinking actually one of the champions where I think we may have crossed a line here on the live, like on live, for example, is like Aurelia with Blade of the Ruined King. This is a case where I think that Aurelia probably feels too bound to this item where it's like, oh, you get set behind on your way to your first item, you just feel miserable. And you don't feel like you're a real character at all until you finish that item. And that, I think, may go a bit far. I don't have an opinion on whether like Swain specifically is over or under the line. But I was taking a look at Swain's data specifically, and I was looking and saying, I don't know. To me, it doesn't really like a lot of the data that I can see doesn't like. It looks like Swain is not over the line, right? As an example, it's not like people in solo lanes are going Lost Chapter into Rylai's or even like tier Rylai's or feeling super pressured to get Rylai's. It is factually a good item on him in carry roles, right? Like the solo lanes and bot lane carry. And it is his most common item, first item as a support right now, Rylai's is specifically. But I think if people actually felt like Swain was useless without Rylai's, you would see a lot more first item Rylai's in solo lanes, and as bot carry, as an example, right? And so it seems like people at least feel happy enough about buying other items that they don't feel hardbound to the item, even if it is obviously a great synergy. And in general, I think something like Rylai's and even Liandry's to a lesser degree makes sense for Swain to be, relatively bound to, as long as they feel good for him and they feel like they are pattern enhancing. And I think they are. Now, whether Swain is over or under the line on is this so pattern enhancing that it's just strictly necessary and he feels bad without it, I don't have a strong opinion there, right? That's something where I don't know the answer to that question. But my personal opinion is that I think we are happier to live in a world where Swain might feel a little bit too dependent on Rylai's than a world where Swain isn't happy with any of the items that he's clicking in the shop, right? One of the things I'll note here is that uh, the version of Rylai's that we could give to Swain's base kit, like let's suppose we just snap our fingers, Rylai's doesn't exist, right? Is Swain a better or worse champion? Well, he probably gets buffed, right? As an example. Does he feel better or worse? Well, it probably depends on how we buff him. Let's suppose that we say, oh, actually, your R2 waves are less slow. They're 3 times as frequent. They do less damage. They're less slow, but it's like you kind of get like that kind of effect. That probably feels a lot worse at 2 items than Swain with Rylai's does on live today, because you invested a bunch of gold and time and opportunity cost into this Rylai's, right? You weren't buying other stuff. You had to get this thing specifically in order to have that effect. Whereas having something baseline on your kit uh, is going to be harder to make satisfying in a lot of ways, right? We can trim power and give Swain more reliability, but if we do that, there's going to be a power trade-off for that, right? Like part of the value of having that kind of effect on an item is that items have opportunity costs and they cost money, and we can give these effects to you later in the game, and there are trade-offs on that, right? Buying a Rylai's first means you didn't get Malignance first, therefore you get to ult less, as an example. And those kinds of trade-offs I think are actually really good and healthy for champions, and I think they tend to make the champions overall feel better because you have these effects that can feel really amazing, and they don't have to be on the base kit, and you can choose whether you're going to opt into them or not in a given game, etc. And you can get them earlier when you're ahead, and so on and so forth, right? Like this all just plays into your champion fantasy scaling over game time, which happens even for early game champions, right? You buy items and they do cool stuff for your champion. And so ultimately, like I said, I don't have a definitive answer to is Swain too bound to these these spell effect items. But my perspective is that generally I think that these champions that are good at applying spell effects, I think that is a positive and not a negative. That they feel good about buying these items that make them powerful in these unique ways, that they are good at applying them, at like either frequently or at long range or to a lot of people or whatever. That I consider to largely be a positive rather than a negative. But too much of it can definitely be a downside. Again, I cite Aurelia as an example where I think we've probably gone too far past the line. So that's my personal perspective, right? Don't necessarily take that as the absolute word. I'm sure other designers have other opinions on that, but that's my perspective personally. So at this point, I'm going to call the current video. I actually don't have any idea how long it will be when I cut it together. I didn't look at how long the original recording was, but yeah, thanks for watching, and I will make another one of these soon, probably. See ya.